Sarah Martinez stared at the rifle scope, her hands trembling as enemy bullets whistled past her position. Just 6 months ago, her commanding officer had called her the worst soldier he'd ever trained, after she failed her 15th combat drill in a row. Her fellow recruits whispered behind her back, calling her deadweight Martinez because she couldn't hit a target at 50 yards, couldn't complete an obstacle course without falling, and fainted during her first live-fire exercise. But today, pinned down in the mountains of Afghanistan with her entire platoon's lives hanging in the balance, Sarah held the only weapon that could save them all. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same rifle she couldn't master in training was now their last hope against an advancing enemy force. What happened in those 6 months that transformed the military's biggest failure into the sniper who would save 23 lives in a single day? This is her story, raw, real, and more incredible than any Hollywood script could imagine. Sarah Martinez had dreamed of military service since she was 8 years old. Watching her grandfather polish his Vietnam War medals every Sunday morning, she imagined herself in uniform, serving her country with honor and distinction. Reality, however, had other plans. The bus ride to Fort Benning felt like a journey to her destiny, but from the moment she stepped off that vehicle, everything went wrong. Basic training was supposed to be challenging, but for Sarah it became a daily nightmare of failure and humiliation. Her first shooting test was a disaster. While other recruits clustered their shots around the target's center, Sarah's bullets seemed to find everywhere except where they were supposed to go. The paper targets looked like they'd been attacked by a wild animal rather than aimed at by a trained soldier. Drill Sergeant Peterson shook his head in disgust as he examined her results. "Martinez, I've seen stormtroopers from Star Wars with better aim," he barked, loud enough for the entire company to hear. "Did you close your eyes and pray when you pulled that trigger?" The laughter from her fellow recruits stung worse than the sergeant's words. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she tried to understand what had gone wrong. She'd practiced the breathing techniques, memorized the fundamentals of marksmanship, and followed every instruction to the letter. Yet somehow her bullets refused to cooperate. Physical training proved equally challenging. The obstacle course that others navigated with growing confidence became Sarah's personal torture chamber. She fell from the rope climb 3 times in one morning, each tumble drawing more snickers from the sidelines. Her pull-ups were weak and shaky, her push-ups sloppy and incomplete. During the long runs that were meant to build endurance and camaraderie, Sarah found herself struggling to keep up, often finishing minutes behind even the slowest members of her unit. The breaking point came during her first live fire exercise. The sound of real ammunition being fired around her triggered something unexpected and overwhelming. As bullets cracked overhead and explosions thundered in the distance, Sarah's vision began to tunnel. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and before she knew it, she was unconscious on the ground, her rifle unfired beside her. When she woke up in the medical tent, the humiliation was complete. Word spread quickly through the barracks that deadweight Martinez had passed out during combat training. The nickname stuck, following her everywhere she went. In the mess hall, recruits would make exaggerated fainting motions when she walked by. During formation, she could hear whispers and see pointed fingers. Her bunkmate, Jennifer Liu, was one of the few who showed any kindness. Jennifer was everything Sarah wasn't: confident, capable, and naturally gifted at every aspect of military training. Her shooting scores were consistently in the top 5%. Her physical fitness tests were exemplary, and she seemed to thrive under pressure that crushed Sarah's spirit. "Don't let them get to you," Jennifer said one evening as Sarah lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling after another day of failures. "Everyone struggles with something. You'll find your groove." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Week after week, the pattern repeated itself. Failed shooting tests, struggled physical challenges, and mounting pressure from instructors who were losing patience with her lack of progress. Other recruits who had started alongside her were advancing through training milestones while Sarah remained stuck, unable to master even the most basic military skills. The psychological toll was devastating. Sarah began to question everything about herself. Had she been delusional to think she could serve in the military? Was she dishonoring her grandfather's memory by being so incompetent? The self-doubt ate at her confidence during the day and kept her awake at night. Drill Sergeant Peterson called her into his office during the 5th week of basic training. His face was stern, his tone professional but cold. Martinez, I'm going to be straight with you, he said, not bothering to look up from the paperwork on his desk. Your performance has been consistently below standards. Your shooting scores are the worst I've seen in 15 years of training recruits. Your physical fitness tests show minimal improvement, and your combat readiness is frankly non-existent. Sarah stood at attention, trying to keep her composure as her world crumbled around her. She had expected this conversation, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. I'm recommending you for administrative separation, Peterson continued. Military service isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in recognizing when something isn't a good fit. You're young. You can find another path. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Administrative separation meant failure, meant going home in disgrace, meant explaining to her family and friends why she couldn't cut it. It meant facing her grandfather and admitting that she wasn't strong enough to follow in his footsteps. Sir, respectfully request permission to continue training, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Peterson finally looked up at her, his expression a mixture of frustration and what might have been sympathy. Martinez, wanting something isn't enough. This isn't summer camp. When you graduate from here, you'll be responsible for other people's lives. You'll be in life and death situations where hesitation or incompetence can get people killed. Based on what I've seen, you're not ready for that responsibility, and I'm not sure you ever will be. That night, Sarah called her parents from the base payphone. Her mother cried when she heard about the recommendation for separation. Her father, a gentleman who had always supported her dreams, struggled to find words of comfort. Maybe the sergeant is right, Mija, he said finally. Maybe you should come home. There are other ways to serve, other ways to make a difference. But as Sarah hung up the phone and walked back toward the barracks, something inside her hardened. She thought about her grandfather, about the stories he'd told her of overcoming impossible odds in Vietnam. She thought about all the people who had told her she was too small, too weak, too sensitive for military service. She thought about the nickname Deadweight Martinez and how it had become the definition of who she was in this place. She made a decision that night that would change everything. She wasn't going home in disgrace. She wasn't going to let failure define her. If she was going to wash out of basic training, she was going to go down fighting. The next morning, Sarah approached Jennifer Liu with a request that surprised them both. I need help, Sarah said simply. I know you're busy with your own training, and I know helping me might hurt your standing with the other recruits, but I'm asking anyway. Will you help me learn to shoot? Jennifer studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Meet me at the range after evening chow, she said. Bring extra ammunition and be ready to work. What Sarah didn't know was that this simple request for help was the first step in a transformation that would take her from the worst recruit in her company to someone capable of extraordinary heroism. She didn't know that her struggles with basic training were preparing her for challenges that would make boot camp look easy. And she certainly didn't know that the skills she was about to develop through sheer determination and countless hours of practice would one day save the lives of 23 fellow soldiers in the mountains of Afghanistan. All she knew was that she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The real journey was just beginning. The shooting range after evening chow was a different world from the chaotic, high-pressure environment of daytime training. The sun was setting over Fort Benning, casting long shadows across the firing line where Sarah stood with Jennifer, holding her rifle with hands that shook from both exhaustion and determination. Jennifer had brought her own training notes, carefully compiled observations about shooting techniques that she'd learned from watching the best marksmen in their company. She studied Sarah's stance, her grip, her breathing pattern, looking for the fundamental flaw that was causing such consistently poor results. Show me exactly how you've been shooting, Jennifer said, settling beside Sarah with her own weapon. Sarah assumed the prone position, steadied her rifle, and went through the motions she'd practiced hundreds of times. She controlled her breathing, lined up the sights, and squeezed the trigger with what she thought was proper technique. The bullet struck wide left of the target, just as it always did. Jennifer watched carefully, then had Sarah repeat the process several times. Finally, she saw it. You're flinching, Jennifer said. Right before you fire, you're anticipating the recoil and moving your head slightly. It's so subtle that even the instructors haven't caught it, but it's throwing off every shot. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and frustration. If the problem was that simple, why hadn't anyone noticed before? Why had she been allowed to fail over and over again without anyone identifying the issue? Military training is designed to push people hard and fast, Jennifer explained as if reading her thoughts. The instructors assume that most problems will work themselves out through repetition and pressure. But sometimes you need individual attention to catch the small things. They spent the next hour working on Sarah's flinch reflex. Jennifer had her practice dry firing without ammunition, focusing on keeping absolutely still through the trigger pull. They used breathing exercises to help Sarah stay relaxed. Jennifer even had her close her eyes while shooting, forcing her to focus on feel rather than anticipation of recoil. Slowly, incrementally, Sarah's shots began to improve. Not dramatically, not enough to impress anyone watching casually, but enough to give her hope that improvement was possible. Their secret training sessions became a nightly routine. While other recruits spent their free time writing letters home or playing cards, Sarah and Jennifer returned to the range. Jennifer proved to be a patient and insightful teacher, breaking down complex shooting mechanics into manageable pieces that Sarah could practice and master one at a time. More importantly, Jennifer helped Sarah understand that her earlier failures weren't character flaws, but technical problems that could be solved with proper instruction and dedicated practice. This shift in mindset was revolutionary for Sarah, who had begun to see herself as fundamentally unsuited for military service. The breakthrough came during the third week of their private training sessions. Sarah was practicing at the 100-yard line, a distance that had seemed impossible just weeks before. She went through her now familiar routine: proper stance, controlled breathing, smooth trigger pull, without anticipating the recoil. The rifle fired, and through the scope, Sarah saw something that made her heart race with excitement. The bullet had struck dead center of the target. Jennifer confirmed it with binoculars, then whooped with joy loud enough to echo across the empty range. Sarah had fired a perfect shot, the kind of precision that she'd only dreamed about during her darkest moments of training. But one perfect shot didn't solve all of Sarah's problems. Her physical fitness still lagged behind her peers, and her confidence in high-stress situations remained shaky. However, the shooting breakthrough had given her something precious: proof that she could improve, that her failures weren't permanent limitations. Sarah began applying the same methodical approach to her other weak areas. She studied the obstacle course during off hours, identifying the specific techniques used by the most successful recruits. She practiced individual components in isolation, working on her rope climbing technique until her hands were raw and bleeding, then practicing some more. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed, but it didn't always generate the response she hoped for. Some fellow recruits admired her persistence, while others saw her extra training as showing off or trying too hard. The nickname Deadweight Martinez persisted, even as her actual performance began to show signs of improvement. The real test came during a major training exercise designed to simulate combat conditions. Recruits were divided into teams and given a series of challenging scenarios that required both individual skills and group coordination. Sarah found herself assigned to a team with some of the strongest performers in their company, including Jennifer. The scenario was complex. Their team had to navigate hostile territory, establish a defensive position, and hold it against an attacking force. Success required accurate shooting, physical endurance, tactical thinking, and the ability to perform under pressure. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive challenge where Sarah had consistently failed in the past. As they moved through the exercise area, Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. This was her chance to prove that all the extra training had made a real difference, but it was also an opportunity for public failure in front of the recruits who would soon be her fellow soldiers. The team reached their assigned position and began establishing defensive positions. Sarah was assigned to provide overwatch with her rifle, a role that required her to identify threats and engage targets at various ranges. As the exercise began, opposing forces started their attack, and Sarah found herself in the exact situation she'd been training for. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Where she once would have panicked at the sound of gunfire, Sarah now felt focused and calm. Her breathing was controlled, her movements were deliberate, and when targets presented themselves, her shots were accurate and effective. She engaged multiple targets throughout the exercise, each shot finding its mark with growing confidence. When her team leader called for covering fire to allow teammates to move positions, Sarah provided it without hesitation. When long-range targets appeared that challenged even experienced shooters, Sarah's careful aim proved effective at distances that would have been impossible for her just months earlier. The exercise concluded with Sarah's team successfully defending their position and accomplishing all their assigned objectives. As they gathered for the after-action review, the exercise evaluators praised the team's performance and specifically noted the accurate rifle work that had been crucial to their success. Drill Sergeant Peterson approached Sarah after the formal review, his expression unreadable.
"Martinez, I watched your performance today," he said. "That was solid shooting under pressure. What changed?"
Sarah thought about mentioning Jennifer's help, the extra training sessions, the hours spent identifying and correcting her flinch reflex. Instead, she simply said, "I kept practicing, Sergeant." Peterson nodded slowly.
"Practice is good, Martinez. But what I saw today was more than practice.
That was instinct, the kind of shooting that happens when everything becomes automatic. That's the difference between a soldier and someone who's just wearing a uniform." It was the first time since arriving at Fort Benning that Sarah had received genuine praise from her drill sergeant. The words meant more to her than any medal or commendation could have. That evening, the atmosphere in the barracks was different. The other recruits who had witnessed Sarah's performance during the exercise began treating her with something approaching respect. The whispered jokes and pointed fingers diminished, replaced by nods of acknowledgement and occasional questions about shooting techniques. Jennifer found Sarah on her bunk that night, cleaning her rifle with the methodical care she'd developed over weeks of intensive practice. "You know what happened out there today, don't you?" Jennifer asked. Sarah looked up from her weapon, uncertain what her friend meant. "You didn't just shoot well," Jennifer continued. "You shot like a soldier. All that technical training we did, all those hours perfecting your form, it all came together when it mattered. That's not something you can fake or get lucky with. That's real skill." As Sarah processed Jennifer's words, she realized something profound had changed inside her. The constant anxiety about failure had been replaced by quiet confidence in her abilities. She no longer saw herself as someone who didn't belong in military service, but as someone who had earned her place through determination and hard work. More importantly, she had discovered something about herself that would prove crucial in the challenges ahead. When everything was on the line, when the pressure was highest and the stakes were real, she didn't crack under the stress. Instead, she became more focused, more precise, more effective than she'd ever been in training. This realization would prove to be the foundation for everything that followed. Sarah Martinez was no longer the recruit who couldn't shoot straight. She was becoming something else entirely, though she wouldn't fully understand what that meant until much later, in the mountains of Afghanistan, when 23 lives would depend on the skills she was just beginning to master. Graduation from basic training felt surreal for Sarah Martinez, standing in formation with her fellow soldiers, wearing the same uniform that had once seemed like a costume she didn't deserve. She reflected on the impossible journey from deadweight Martinez to someone who had earned her place among these capable men and women. Her shooting scores in the final weeks of basic training had been consistently strong, though not spectacular. She had become a solid, reliable marksman rather than a natural prodigy. But the transformation went deeper than technical skills. Sarah had developed something invaluable: the ability to perform under pressure, and the confidence that came from overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges. After graduation, Sarah received orders that would shape the next phase of her military career. She was assigned to Fort Campbell, home of the 101st Airborne Division, where she would serve as an infantry soldier with the 2nd Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment. The unit had a proud history and a reputation for excellence that both intimidated and inspired her. The transition from basic training to an active duty unit brought new challenges and opportunities. Sarah's fellow soldiers in the 2nd Battalion were experienced professionals who evaluated new arrivals based on performance rather than training scores. She would need to prove herself all over again, but this time she had the confidence that came from knowing she could improve and adapt. Her platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was a veteran of multiple deployments who had little patience for soldiers who couldn't contribute effectively to the unit's mission. During Sarah's first week with the battalion, he observed her performance during training exercises with the critical eye of someone whose life might depend on her competence. "Martinez, "You shoot decent for someone straight out of basic," he told her after a routine marksmanship training session.
"But decent won't cut it when we deploy. You need to be better than decent.
You need to be someone your teammates can count on when everything goes wrong." Rodriguez's words weren't criticism but challenge. He had identified Sarah as someone with potential who needed additional development. This recognition led to an opportunity that would prove crucial to Sarah's future: assignment to the battalion's designated marksman program. The designated marksman program was designed to train soldiers who could provide accurate rifle fire at distances beyond the capability of standard infantry weapons. It wasn't sniper school, but it was specialized training that required exceptional shooting skills and the mental discipline to perform precision shooting in combat conditions. Sarah's selection for the program surprised many of her fellow soldiers, who knew her reputation from basic training. Some questioned whether she was ready for such specialized training. Others saw it as an opportunity for someone who had already demonstrated remarkable improvement to develop even further. The training was conducted by Master Sergeant Williams, a former Special Forces soldier whose expertise in precision shooting was legendary throughout the division. Williams had trained hundreds of designated marksmen over his career, and he had little tolerance for soldiers who weren't completely committed to excellence. "This isn't regular infantry training," Williams explained to the class of 12 soldiers selected for the program. "Designated marksmen operate in a different world from regular riflemen. You'll be taking shots that regular soldiers can't make, at distances they can't reach, under conditions that would make most people give up. If you're not ready to push yourself harder than you've ever been pushed before, you should leave now." Nobody left, but Williams' words proved prophetic. The training was physically and mentally exhausting, requiring levels of precision and consistency that challenged even experienced shooters. Students learned advanced marksmanship techniques, ballistics calculations, range estimation, and the mental skills needed to make accurate shots under extreme stress. Sarah approached the training with the same methodical determination that had helped her overcome her early struggles. She took detailed notes on every lesson, practiced techniques until they became automatic, and spent extra time on the range working to perfect her skills. Her background of having to fight for every improvement served her well in an environment where natural talent alone wasn't sufficient. The other students in the program were strong shooters who had been selected based on demonstrated ability. But Sarah's work ethic and dedication set her apart. While others relied on natural ability, Sarah methodically analyzed every aspect of her performance, identifying weaknesses and developing specific plans to address them. Master Sergeant Williams noticed Sarah's approach and began providing additional instruction tailored to her specific needs. He recognized that she processed information differently from naturally gifted shooters, requiring more detailed explanations but ultimately achieving more consistent results. "Martinez, you're never going to be a naturally gifted shooter," Williams told her during a one-on-one training session. "But you might become something more valuable, a completely reliable one. Natural talent can be inconsistent. Trained skill, properly developed, works the same way every time." The program culminated in a series of challenging tests that evaluated students' ability to engage targets at various ranges under different conditions. The scenarios included shooting from awkward positions, engaging multiple targets in sequence, and making accurate shots while under simulated stress conditions. Sarah's performance during the final tests surprised everyone, including herself. Her shots were consistently accurate across all distances and conditions. Where other students occasionally had brilliant performances followed by disappointing ones, Sarah's results were remarkably consistent. She had become exactly what Williams had predicted: completely reliable. The graduation ceremony for the designated marksman program was small and informal, but it represented a major milestone in Sarah's development. She had earned recognition as a specialist, someone with skills that set her apart from regular infantry soldiers. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could master complex, demanding skills through dedicated effort. Following completion of the program, Sarah returned to her infantry unit with new responsibilities and capabilities. Her platoon leader, Lieutenant Jackson, assigned her to provide precision rifle support during training exercises and eventually during combat operations. The role required her to work closely with squad leaders and team commanders, providing accurate fire at targets that regular riflemen couldn't effectively engage. The additional training and specialized role changed how other soldiers viewed Sarah. The nickname Deadweight Martinez became a memory from another life. Her fellow soldiers began seeking her advice on shooting techniques, and newer soldiers looked to her as an example of someone who had succeeded through determination rather than natural ability. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The constant self-doubt and anxiety about her capabilities had been replaced by quiet confidence based on demonstrated competence. She knew exactly what she could do with her rifle under various conditions, and she trusted in her ability to perform when performance mattered. This confidence would be tested sooner than anyone expected. The 2nd Battalion received deployment orders for Afghanistan, where they would be supporting operations in the mountainous regions near the Pakistani border. The area was known for challenging terrain, unpredictable weather, and enemy forces that had been fighting in those mountains for decades. As Sarah prepared for her first combat deployment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Less than 2 years earlier, she had been on the verge of being dismissed from basic training as unsuitable for military service. Now, she was preparing to serve as a designated marksman in one of the most challenging environments the military operated in. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. Every skill she had developed, every ounce of confidence she had built, had been earned through countless hours of practice and gradual improvement. She had learned that natural talent was less important than persistent effort, that failure was only permanent if you accepted it as such. Jennifer Liu, her friend from basic training, had been assigned to a different unit and would be deploying to a different area of Afghanistan. Before they parted ways, she reminded Sarah of how far she had come. "Remember when you asked me to help you learn to shoot?" Jennifer said. "You were so desperate, so convinced that you were hopeless. Look at you now. You're deploying as a designated marksman to one of the most challenging areas in Afghanistan. That's not luck, Sarah. That's who you've become." As Sarah boarded the aircraft that would take her unit to Afghanistan, she carried with her more than just specialized equipment and advanced training. She carried the knowledge that she could overcome seemingly impossible challenges through determination and hard work. She carried the confidence that came from proving herself again and again in increasingly difficult circumstances. What she didn't know was that all of her training, all of her preparation, all of the character development that had brought her from failure to competence was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. In the mountains of Afghanistan, she would face situations where all of her skills would be pushed to their absolute limits, where the lives of her fellow soldiers would depend on her ability to perform with precision under the most extreme pressure possible. The real test of everything she had become was waiting for her in those distant mountains, and it would prove that sometimes the greatest heroes are forged not from natural talent, but from the determination to never give up, no matter how impossible the challenge might seem. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman in the early morning hours, kicking up clouds of dust that turned the sunrise into an orange haze across the Afghan landscape. Sarah Martinez stepped onto the landing zone, carrying her designated marksman rifle and a pack loaded with equipment that would sustain her through the months ahead. The mountains surrounding the base rose like ancient sentinels, beautiful and threatening in equal measure. Chapman was a bustling hub of military activity, home to multiple units conducting operations throughout the region. The base itself was a study in organized chaos. Soldiers moving with purpose between buildings, helicopters arriving and departing with regular frequency, and the constant background noise of generators and communication equipment that never stopped. Sarah's unit, the 2nd Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, was assigned to a section of the base that housed their living quarters, command facilities, and equipment storage. The accommodations were Spartan but functional, and Sarah was grateful to have a place to organize her gear and begin adapting to the environment that would be home for the next year. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez gathered the platoon for their first briefing after arrival. The walls of the briefing room were covered with maps, photographs, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of the challenges they would face. The area of operations included some of the most difficult terrain in Afghanistan, with elevations reaching over 10,000 feet and weather conditions that could change from clear skies to blizzard conditions within hours. "This isn't Iraq," Rodriguez explained to the assembled soldiers. "The enemy here has been fighting in these mountains for longer than most of you have been alive. They know every trail, every hiding spot, every advantage this terrain offers. They're patient, they're smart, and they're completely committed to making life difficult for us. The intelligence reports described an enemy force that relied heavily on ambush tactics, using the mountainous terrain to their advantage. They would attack coalition forces from concealed positions, then disappear into the landscape before effective counterattacks could be organized. The key to successful operations would be superior firepower, tactical discipline, and the ability to outthink opponents who knew the ground better than any outsider ever could. Sarah's role as designated marksman would be crucial in these conditions. The long sight lines available in mountainous terrain were perfect for precision shooting. But the same distances that gave her rifle its effectiveness also gave enemy forces multiple options for concealment and movement. She would need to be constantly alert, ready to identify threats at extreme ranges and engage them before they could threaten her fellow soldiers. The first weeks at Chapman were spent in intensive training and acclimatization. Sarah and her fellow soldiers practiced patrolling techniques specific to mountainous terrain, learned to recognize signs of enemy activity, and conducted live-fire exercises using the ranges available near the base. The thin air at high altitude required adjustments to shooting techniques, and the extreme temperature variations between day and night created challenges for equipment maintenance and personal comfort. Sarah found herself adapting more quickly than expected to the deployment environment. The disciplined approach to training that had served her well in the United States proved even more valuable in combat conditions, where attention to detail and consistent performance could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her first combat operation came 3 weeks after arrival at Chapman. The mission was a routine patrol through a valley suspected of harboring enemy weapons caches. Intelligence reports suggested the area was relatively safe, with enemy activity limited to occasional surveillance rather than active combat operations. The patrol consisted of 24 soldiers divided into 3 squads, with Sarah attached to the lead squad as their designated marksman. Lieutenant Jackson led the patrol, with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez serving as patrol sergeant and coordinating the movement of individual squads through the challenging terrain. The patrol began before dawn, with soldiers moving in single file along a trail that wound through rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation. Sarah carried her rifle at the ready, constantly scanning the surrounding high ground for signs of enemy observation or potential ambush positions. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than her equipment as she realized that her fellow soldiers were depending on her ability to spot threats before they became deadly. The morning passed without incident, but Sarah noticed signs that concerned her. Fresh footprints in areas where local civilians were unlikely to travel, disturbed vegetation that suggested recent movement, and the complete absence of wildlife that might indicate human activity in the area. She reported these observations to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who acknowledged them but noted that intelligence reports had indicated minimal enemy presence. The patrol reached the suspected weapons cache location around midday and began a thorough search of caves and hidden areas where materials might be concealed. The search revealed evidence of recent activity, including fresh food scraps and recent campfire remains, but no weapons or other military equipment. As the patrol prepared to return to base, Sarah positioned herself on high ground to provide overwatch, while the other soldiers organized their equipment and prepared for movement. Through her rifle scope, she began a systematic scan of the surrounding terrain, looking for anything that might indicate enemy observation or preparation for attack. What she saw made her heart race with sudden alarm. In a rocky outcropping approximately 800 meters away, she could see the distinctive glint of sunlight reflecting off metal. Training her scope on the location, she could make out the unmistakable shape of a rifle barrel protruding from behind cover. Sarah immediately activated her radio to report the sighting to Lieutenant Jackson. As she spoke, she continued observing the position and identified additional threats. There were at least 3 enemy fighters positioned in locations that would allow them to attack the patrol with devastating effect once the soldiers moved into the open terrain required to return to base. Lieutenant Jackson received Sarah's report and immediately ordered the patrol to take cover while he assessed the situation. The enemy positions were too well concealed to be seen with the naked eye, but Sarah's training and equipment allowed her to maintain observation and provide detailed information about their locations and apparent capabilities. The tactical situation was challenging. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves to control the most direct route back to base, forcing the patrol either to fight through their positions or to take a much longer route through terrain that offered additional opportunities for ambush. Either choice involved significant risks, but Lieutenant Jackson decided that engaging the enemy from their current positions offered the best chance for success. Sarah was assigned to engage the most distant enemy position, while other soldiers in the patrol provided suppressive fire against closer threats. This would be her first shot fired in combat, the moment when all of her training would be tested under the most extreme conditions possible. As she prepared to engage the target, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The anxiety and self-doubt that had once plagued her training were absent, replaced by the focused concentration she had developed through countless hours of practice. She controlled her breathing, calculated the effects of wind and elevation on her bullet's trajectory, and lined up her shot with the mechanical precision that had become second nature. The rifle fired, and through her scope, Sarah saw the enemy fighter collapse. Her shot had been accurate at a distance that challenged even experienced marksmen, under combat conditions that would have rattled many soldiers. Without pause, she shifted to the second target and engaged with equal precision. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah engaged multiple targets at various ranges, each shot carefully aimed and precisely delivered. Her fellow soldiers provided covering fire and advanced on enemy positions, but it was Sarah's accurate shooting that neutralized the primary threats and allowed the patrol to regain control of the tactical situation. When the engagement ended, 3 enemy fighters had been killed and several others had fled deeper into the mountains. No American soldiers had been injured, largely due to Sarah's early detection of the ambush and her accurate fire that prevented the enemy from executing their planned attack. As the patrol organized for movement back to base, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with an expression of respect and gratitude. "Martinez, that was outstanding shooting under pressure," he said. "You spotted those fighters when nobody else could see them, and your shots were exactly where they needed to be. That's the difference between designated marksman training and just being a good shot. You probably saved lives today." The return to Chapman gave Sarah time to process what had happened during her first combat engagement. She had performed exactly as her training had prepared her to perform, but the reality of taking lives in combat was sobering in ways that no amount of preparation could fully address. That evening, Sarah called her parents from the base communication facility. She couldn't discuss the details of the day's operation, but she could tell them that she was safe and performing well in her assigned role. "I'm proud of you, Mija," her father said over the crackling connection. "Your grandfather would be proud too. He always said that real courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." As Sarah reflected on her father's words, she realized that her journey from the failure of basic training to combat effectiveness had taught her something profound about the nature of courage and capability. Success wasn't about natural talent or the absence of fear, but about the willingness to persist through challenges and continue improving even when improvement seemed impossible. Her first combat engagement had proven that all of her training and preparation had been worthwhile, but it had also shown her that the skills she had developed were just the foundation for even greater challenges ahead. In the months that followed, she would face increasingly difficult situations that would test not just her shooting ability, but her courage, her judgment, and her commitment to her fellow soldiers. The mountains of Afghanistan had many more tests waiting for Sarah Martinez, and the most challenging of all was still to come. But she had proven something important to herself and to her fellow soldiers. She was no longer the recruit who couldn't shoot straight. She had become someone her teammates could depend on when everything was on the line. The mission briefing on March 15 seemed routine by the standards Sarah Martinez had grown accustomed to during her 8 months in Afghanistan. Intelligence reports indicated enemy activity in a remote valley system approximately 20 kilometers from forward operating base Chapman, and the 2nd Battalion was tasked with conducting a reconnaissance patrol to assess the situation and gather information about enemy capabilities in the area. What made this mission different from previous patrols was its scope and complexity. Instead of a single squad or platoon, the entire company would be involved, with multiple elements moving through different routes to converge on the target area. Sarah's platoon would serve as the primary reconnaissance element, approaching the valley from the north while other units provided overwatch and blocking positions from adjacent ridgelines. Lieutenant Jackson explained the mission during the final briefing before departure. "Intelligence suggests we're looking at a staging area for enemy operations against coalition forces. We need to determine the size and capability of enemy forces in the area, identify any weapons, caches, or supply routes, and assess the terrain for potential future operations. The mission was scheduled to last 3 days, with the company establishing temporary patrol bases in the mountains and conducting detailed reconnaissance of multiple valley systems. Sarah would be operating as designated marksman for her platoon, providing precision fire support and serving as an additional set of eyes for threats at long range. The patrol departed Chapman before sunrise, with soldiers moving in column formation through terrain that had become familiar over months of operations. The early morning air was crisp and clear, with visibility extending for miles across the mountain landscape. Sarah felt the familiar weight of her equipment and the comfortable presence of her rifle, knowing that both would be essential in the hours and days ahead. The approach to the target area required 6 hours of movement through increasingly difficult terrain. The patrol climbed from the base elevation of about 7,000 feet to over 10,000 feet, following goat trails and ridgeline routes that provided concealment from observation while allowing rapid movement toward their objective. Sarah's training in mountain operations had prepared her for the physical demands of high-altitude patrolling, but the mental challenges were more subtle and potentially more dangerous. The thin air affected concentration and decision-making ability, while the extreme temperature variations between sunny and shaded areas required constant attention to equipment and personal comfort. As the patrol approached the target valley, Lieutenant Jackson deployed his soldiers into overwatch positions that provided excellent observation of the terrain below, while offering concealment from enemy forces that might be operating in the area. Sarah positioned herself on a rocky outcropping that gave her clear fields of fire across the entire valley system, with sightlines extending over 1,200 meters in multiple directions. The valley appeared empty during the initial observation period, with no signs of human activity visible through rifle scopes and binoculars. But Sarah's experience over the past months had taught her that appearances could be deceiving in Afghanistan, where enemy forces had perfected the art of concealment and camouflage. She began a systematic scan of the terrain, looking for subtle indicators that might reveal enemy presence. Disturbed vegetation, unnatural shadows, the absence of wildlife, and other small signs that required patience and experience to recognize. After 40 minutes of careful observation, she identified something that made her heart rate increase with sudden alertness. In a cluster of rocks and scrub vegetation approximately 800 meters away, Sarah could see what appeared to be a carefully constructed fighting position. The camouflage was excellent, nearly invisible to casual observation, but her trained eye could detect the straight lines and regular patterns that indicated human construction rather than natural rock formation. She immediately reported her observation to Lieutenant Jackson, who directed other soldiers to focus their attention on the area Sarah had identified. Additional observation confirmed her assessment. There was definitely a prepared position in that location, and careful scrutiny revealed at least 2 more similar positions at different points around the valley. The tactical situation had become significantly more complex. What had been expected to be a routine reconnaissance patrol was now a potential combat engagement against an unknown number of enemy fighters in prepared defensive positions. Lieutenant Jackson called for support from other elements of the company, while his platoon maintained observation and prepared for possible combat. The response came faster than anyone expected. Enemy forces had apparently been observing the American patrol and were preparing to initiate contact on their own terms. Sarah saw muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the valley as enemy fighters opened fire with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The initial enemy fire was devastatingly effective. Several soldiers in Sarah's platoon were hit in the opening moments of the engagement, including Lieutenant Jackson, who was struck by rifle fire and seriously wounded. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez immediately assumed command of the platoon and began organizing defensive positions while calling for medical evacuation and additional support. Sarah found herself in a position of crucial importance. Her location provided observation and fields of fire that covered much of the enemy's defensive network, making her the key to suppressing enemy fire and allowing wounded soldiers to be moved to safety. But the distances involved and the number of targets required, shooting skills and tactical judgment at the absolute limits of her capabilities. The enemy fighters were well-trained and disciplined, using their prepared positions effectively while coordinating their fire to maximum effect. Sarah could identify at least 12 different fighting positions, each occupied by multiple enemy fighters, all positioned to control key terrain features and dominate the valley floor where American soldiers were pinned down. She began engaging targets systematically, prioritizing threats based on their immediate danger to wounded soldiers and their tactical importance to the overall enemy defense. Each shot required precise calculation of range, wind speed, elevation differences, and target movement, all while under intense enemy fire that sent bullets cracking past her position with terrifying frequency. Her first target was an enemy machine gunner whose fire was preventing American soldiers from reaching cover. The distance was over 900 meters, requiring precise holdover calculations and perfect trigger control. Sarah's shot struck the gunner's center mass, immediately reducing the volume of enemy fire and allowing several soldiers to move to better positions. She shifted to the second target, an enemy fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher who was preparing to engage American positions. This shot was even more challenging as the target was partially concealed behind rocks and moving between firing positions. Sarah waited for the right moment, then fired a shot that eliminated the threat just as the enemy fighter was preparing to fire. The engagement continued for what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes. Sarah engaged target after target, each shot carefully aimed and precisely delivered, despite the chaos and violence surrounding her position. Her rifle became an extension of her will, each round sent downrange with deadly accuracy, that gradually shifted the tactical balance in favor of American forces. But the most critical moment came when Sarah observed enemy fighters attempting to flank the American positions by moving through a concealed ravine that would allow them to attack from an unexpected direction. If successful, this flanking movement would put the enemy in position to overrun American defensive positions and inflict devastating casualties on soldiers who were already pinned down by effective fire from the front. The range to the flanking enemy was over 1,100 meters, at the extreme limit of her rifle's effective range and her own shooting ability. The targets were moving quickly through difficult terrain, presenting only brief opportunities for engagement. Missing would mean that enemy fighters would reach positions where they could attack wounded American soldiers who had no chance to defend themselves. Sarah controlled her breathing, calculated the complex ballistics required for such an extreme shot, and waited for the right moment. When the lead enemy fighter paused in his movement, she fired a shot that seemed to hang in the air forever before finding its target. The fighter collapsed and the flanking movement stalled as other enemy forces took cover. She continued engaging the flanking force, firing shot after shot at maximum range while enemy return fire intensified around her position. Bullets struck the rocks around her, sending stone fragments flying, but she maintained her focus and continued firing with mechanical precision. The flanking attack was broken, but at tremendous cost. Sarah had expended most of her ammunition and was down to fewer than 20 rounds. Enemy fire was becoming more accurate as they identified her position and began concentrating their efforts on neutralizing the American marksman who was causing such devastating losses to their forces. It was at this moment that reinforcements from other elements of the company finally arrived, approaching the battle from multiple directions and catching enemy forces in a coordinated attack that broke their defensive positions. The enemy began withdrawing deeper into the mountains, carrying their wounded and leaving behind equipment and prepared positions that had cost them so heavily to construct. As the immediate threat diminished, Sarah finally had an opportunity to assess the larger situation. Her platoon had suffered multiple casualties, but her accurate shooting had prevented what could have been a complete disaster. The wounded soldiers were still alive because enemy fighters had been unable to maneuver into positions where they could deliver finishing attacks. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah as medical evacuation helicopters arrived to transport the wounded back to Chapman. His expression combined exhaustion, relief, and something approaching awe. "Martinez, I don't know how to describe what you just did," he said. "You were engaging targets at ranges I didn't think were possible with that rifle. You stopped that flanking attack when nobody else even saw it coming. You probably saved every life in this platoon today." The helicopter evacuation allowed Sarah to accompany Lieutenant Jackson and other wounded soldiers back to Chapman, where she could finally process the magnitude of what had occurred. During the after-action review, military intelligence officers determined that her platoon had engaged a company-sized enemy force in prepared defensive positions, facing odds of nearly 3-1 against experienced fighters on terrain of their choosing. The official casualty count showed that 5 American soldiers had been wounded, none fatally, while enemy losses were estimated at over 20 killed and additional wounded. The difference in casualties was attributed largely to Sarah's precision shooting, which had disrupted enemy plans and prevented them from capitalizing on their initial tactical advantages. But for Sarah, the numbers didn't capture the full significance of what had happened. She had been tested under the most extreme conditions possible and had performed not just adequately but exceptionally. The recruit who had once been recommended for dismissal from basic training had become the soldier who saved 23 lives in a single day. The recognition came in multiple forms. Sarah received the Bronze Star Medal for her actions during the engagement, becoming one of the youngest female soldiers to receive the decoration for combat valor. More importantly to her, she received the respect and gratitude of every soldier who had been in that valley, men and women who knew that they owed their lives to her skill and courage. When she called her parents to tell them about the medal ceremony, her father's voice broke with emotion. "Your grandfather would be so proud, mija," he said. "You've honored his memory and shown that courage and determination can overcome any challenge. You're a hero, Sarah. You saved all those people." But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had simply done what her training had prepared her to do. Someone who had refused to give up when giving up would have meant the loss of her fellow soldiers' lives. The journey from failure to heroism had been long and difficult, but it had taught her something valuable about the nature of human potential. Looking back on her transformation from deadweight Martinez to a decorated combat veteran, Sarah understood that the most important victories weren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments of determination, when someone chooses to keep trying despite overwhelming evidence that success is impossible. Her story became legendary within the 2nd Battalion, and eventually throughout the 101st Airborne Division, not just as an example of effective marksmanship under pressure, but as proof that the military's faith in people's ability to grow and improve, even when that growth seemed impossible, could produce extraordinary results when it mattered most. Sarah Martinez had become exactly what her drill sergeant had once told her she could never be: a soldier her teammates could depend on when everything was on the line. The recruit who couldn't shoot straight had become the marksman who never missed when lives depended on her accuracy.